without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Sean McGreer from Patreon and Andy Deep from Discord. Patreon and Discord are interesting specimens in the tech landscape. They manage platforms and run trust and safety programs for both of those platforms. And I think that we all kind of wonder, what is it that these folks do with their day? How do they think about things? How do they come up with the rules that they do? How do they handle? Hey, Tucker.
Yes.
Howdy, my friend. You're in a session later today.
I know. Can I listen though?
You're on the speaker link.
Oh shoot. Sorry. Off to a good start. Bye guys.
Check out the speaker descriptions. All right.
I did double check it, but my bad. Bye.
All good. Well, we're off to a great start. And as you can see, they're a lot of fun. And hopefully so are we. So so Patreon and Discord have had an interesting year in particular because of the lockdown, the kooky behaviors that some folks have been getting into. And while they've been in locked up at home, you know, we've watched these phenomena quite closely. You know, even the ministerial press has been noting that churches and other kinds of communities like these are kind of losing it. They need the human contact and all of that, and so they turn to areas where they can congregate online, and that leads to, in some cases, rabbit holes, and it leads to troublesome behavior. But even aside from that, you know, you have fraud, child safety issues, a variety of things that that folks really need to think about as brands, as creators, and how to stay away from that. You know, we saw the phenomenon of Wayfair and Comet Ping Pong, the pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. that was famously in the crosshairs of the QAnon crowd. You know, what should companies be looking out for? And then finally, you know, what are emergent issues that everybody should be thinking about and watching very closely? Platforms like Patreon and Discord get the really early signals and think very carefully about these things. So, Sean, we're going to kick off with you. Describe a day in the life of a Patreon person like yourself who's focused on trust and safety and risk.
Yeah, so I'm a content policy lead at Patreon, and the team with which I work closest is the content moderation team. They're kind of the policy enforcement arm of our organization. My day, usually a solid breakdown is probably part policy development, you know, reading and writing and digging through the data of content already on the platform or prospective content that could be funded through the platform. And seeing what underlying risks lie therein, and drafting risk assessments and maybe eventual policy recommendations in response to reading those risks. Another part of that is training internal stakeholders on those policies. Those internal stakeholders can be, well, they more often than not are the content moderation team, but sometimes they are some of our marketing teammates, some of our product personnel. Sometimes it's an executive who's going to be speaking in an environment where they will need to be privy to these risks. And then we also try to build a lot of time in for the unforeseen, things that we can't really prepare for in the late stage startup space. For a tech platform, you got to build time in for you know, things that you don't see coming. So yeah, maybe it's useful to back up a little bit and describe what Patreon is. It's a membership platform for creators. Creators use Patreon, creators from podcasters to visual artists, musicians, essayists use Patreon to generate income or production funds from their biggest fans, from their audience, and then in return they give them some sort of unique benefit for that contribution. Sometimes it's early access, sometimes it's extended clips, and where I sit is in sorting out what in those campaigns is and is not supportable, what is in line with the type of community that Patreon is trying to facilitate and foster, and what is not. And that is kind of like an ever-changing thing. So the risk assessments are set to stick with the times, stick with what's appropriate, for a platform to involve itself in, and then also make sure we're centering at every stop that we can, the smaller voices in society that don't necessarily have advocacy at the levels of the corporate. So I think that's a pretty all-encompassing overview of what a day in the content policy development life is at Patreon. It's part policy development, part policy training, and then just a whole lot of space in there to deal with the house fires that are sure to come.
How about you, Andy?
Yeah, from a high level, I think really what the overarching goal is for any trust and safety or moderation team is you're trying to establish and nourish pro-social behavioral norms on your platform. And what those norms are dictated by what your company values are. And so from the day-to-day, a lot of it is dealing with current events that are going on. So you can imagine that a lot of our fires are tied into things that happen in society. We're a little bit different than Patreon in the sense that Discord is a communications platform. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, I would describe Discord as like a Discord server is kind of like a house, and in this house you can have different thematic channels, right? You can have a food channel where you share your creations, a pet channels where you're like, everybody look at my cat or my dog, or I don't know, my sugar glider. And so a lot of these spaces create an opportunity for people to chat, and it's pretty private by default. And the challenges that come in with that require us to think about ways in which privacy can be weaponized. And so on the reactive side, or how we keep our platform safe, we actually think of 3 different pillars. The reactive side is dealing with harm after harm has occurred. The proactive side is how do I find harm that is deliberately trying to mask itself or hide itself. So for instance, Julian, if you and I were planning to rob the bank, we would not be reporting each other. So how do I deliberately find people trying to slip under the radar? And then the preventative harm is really safety by design. So how do I create a platform? How do I design products and design features that make it inherently more difficult and challenging for someone to want to cause abuse and chaos on the platform? So a typical day-to-day would be, dealing on the reactive side, dealing with reports that do come in from our users, from third-party reporters, from law enforcement. On the proactive side, it's really looking at the trends that are coming up that we see from the reactive side to inform us. So, hey, you can imagine that when all the BLM protests happened, reports of racism and hate speech spiked, right? It was a time where people were a little more vigilant. People were, the bad actors were more fired up to disrupt a lot of communities. And so a lot of this work that we're doing here is basically trying to understand what abuse looks like, how it's going to take form in our platform, and what the possible impacts are going to be for our users, for our brand, and for society at large.
Got it. And I'm curious, outside of your platform, where does the best information come from? I think what most people experience with your platforms and some of the other ones that have been around a little bit longer is that they read about it in the media, or they get a timeout on the platform or something like that, and they're not really sure why. And that's about it. How helpful is the media, and where does your best information come from outside of your own resources in-house?
I guess I could take that first. The media is pretty helpful. It's not always helpful, but in most instances, it is, be it legacy or independent news sources do kind of help point us in a direction that we should be gauging user sentiment or user trajectory by. We also get a lot of white papers and studies inbound from NGOs. We do our best to not always try and align ourselves with the opinion of an NGO, but we do take that data and try and make an informed decision, be it a policy decision or sometimes just indecision based off that inbound data. A lot of it though is looking at what is happening, looking at like micro trends on the platform, like what type of content is launching. Like, you know, we have a little over 200,000, probably a little bit more than 200,000 now, creator campaigns on Patreon. Every few weeks, there's a few hundred or thousand more campaigns that launch. Want to see what they're, what is driving these new podcasters? Why is sailing content becoming so popular on Patreon? They're like weather trends in Australia that's making this like a more lucrative content theme for people, stuff like that.
Or
It's all encompassing. Sorry, say it again.
And those Democrats,
Yes, yeah,
must mean something.
Yeah, yes, it's a combination of like media sourcing, looking at where traffic is coming from, where traffic is leading to off of the website, all of those. But to bottom line, the answer to your specific question about the media is like, often we are reading very similar things to what the users are reading. We're diversifying sources. We will not exclusively read the New York Times opinion section to try and generate our stance on a matter that's going on in the outside world. But we're reading lots of different things from a bunch of different sources.
Do you guys work with political risk analysts or investigations or intelligence firms?
Intelligence firms, I haven't personally, but political risk analysts, yes. Been on calls, been in email threads with them, read a few of their papers. Everyone who is reaching out to us is working towards something and trying to divine as much is sometimes easier said than done. But these people are interested for a reason, and we try to cut to the core of that and to make an informed decision.
Gotcha. How about you, Andy?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if the question here is like, hey, like how do we kind of pull back the curtains here and kind of understand how decisions are made for the safety of our platform? There's a great book called Behind the Screen, Content Moderation in the Shadows of Social Media, and it's by Sarah T. Roberts. And it's a really good walkthrough of what happens when content moderation goes from being a volunteer activity for relatively small communal spaces to something that is largely commercialized. But like when we think about your example of what happens when you get a warning from a platform and you don't really understand why, the challenge behind that is to scale policy and enforcement out to a platform that might be hundreds of millions of users large. You run the risk of certain abuse vectors like social engineering or reverse engineering your policies or rules, right? Some people might ask like, hey, when Facebook lists its community guidelines or when Discord lists its community guidelines, why is there not like an explicit list of what is categorized as like, for instance, NSFW content, right? How do I know what NSFW content is? And the challenge behind policy writing when it comes to that is people will look at this definitive list and it primes them to expect like this is the absolute like not allowed content, but anything not on this list is kind of a gray area, or hey, because it's not listed, there should be no problem with me having this here. And so there's a fine balance between offering transparency to a broad user, a platform of users, and running the risk of actually causing chaos and confusion with that additional transparency. I think in terms of how do we, or what sources do we use to kind of keep up to date? They're very similar to Sean. We won't just look at one single source of information, but the media can be helpful. I mentioned current events that happen in the world off like tech spaces. That can often be a pretty powerful yellow canary for anything that might be considered an upcoming risk, right? There were a lot of writings about, say, like QAnon or even about the Capitol like uprising before these things actually happened. So keeping an ear to the ground is always going to be helpful for these media sources. Tech writers like Casey Newton tend to be pretty helpful in kind of understanding the lay of the land and how a non-tech employee might be thinking about these spaces. And also, we have relationships with law enforcement. So I help run the child safety programs here at Discord. So in a lot of our conversations with NCMEC, which is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or even the FBI, there might be conversations where it's like, hey, like we've worked together on this before. We actually think this is something that you should keep an eye out for or keep on your radar. We actually believe that this is something that is up and coming. So using different signals from different sources has always been helpful.
That is very helpful. I want to make 2 quick comments. Folks, we don't really do Q&A, but what we can do is that if you have things that you want to mention or a comment or something that you hope that I can weave in, please write that in the chat box. That would be wonderful to hear what your views are and give these 2 speakers some love. Those are the rules all day, so I'll mention it again, but yeah, let us know what you're thinking and if there's any burning questions that you just need to ask these guys. The other thing is, if you're a speaker, read the speaker guide. I see you guys tuning in. I know that it was long, but it was very clear. So it happens every time. There's costs and benefits to doing all this stuff, but we didn't want to use a huge platform because those things are clunky too. So this was just the best of all worlds for everybody. But do read the speaker's guide. So what kind of criteria go into your risk assessments, and how do you look at emerging threats, social, political, things in niche areas that are in coded language, for instance? How do you guys think about that? Sean, we'll go with you first.
I can answer it in one word and then I can expand, and I would say apprehensively. With apprehension is the way we approach a lot of these more recent items. And I think a good way to kind of illustrate the process is the way we looked at QAnon. So Patreon started disallowing sincere propagation of QAnon content in October of last year, so October of 2020. But the risk assessment.
Oh, wait. Sincere propagation. Just a quick definition of sincere versus whatever else that may be.
So yeah, we have a lot of creators who will discuss QAnon, opine on it, but they will not propagate it. They will discuss like as though it's like a news
You're talking
item.
about true believers.
Yeah, basically, and it's kind of that's kind of like a difficult thing to discern. So what we looked at was like repeated propagation without any mitigating elements in there. So we have a lot of creators who will talk about it, like, look at this thing that's happening, this phenomenon. We didn't want people who were not trying to advance the QAnon narrative to get wrapped up in our disallowance of that content. So that when I say sincere propagation, this is people who say that QAnon is true and here's what we should do about it. Like that's kind of like that's kind of the scope of that policy then. So in October is when we actually rolled out that policy disallowing that very narrow content theme. But the risk assessment that led to that policy was like 18 months old. We really went to bat to try and facilitate discourse around it and even allow people to explore it with genuine curiosity for as long as we could. So what we're looking at when we draft that risk assessment is we want to know how pervasive it is on the platform. What is it advocating for, which is a difficult thing to discern with something like QAnon, because at its core, it is just a very vague series of postings from an individual or from a group of people. We actually don't really know. But the creator apparatus around QAnon was basically interpreting, kind of at your leisure, what those vague postings were. So we were looking at where are these people linking to and from on their Patreon page? How much money are they making? What does their growth look like? Does that growth, is that working in parallel with any external news items? And then like, what are they actually advocating for? what actions are they calling for? Not just like what are they pontificating about or trying to explore as interesting, but like what are they saying people should do as a result of it? And then we also we look at the landscape. We look at like what other platforms are doing. We really try to institute as much shared knowledge, be it via like communicating with our analogs at another platform, or just looking at what they're communicating externally and try and avoid pitfalls that other platforms have unfortunately stepped into. It's really all encompassing, but we do, just to like bottom line it, we have a document. It has it's a risk assessment template where we're looking at how much money they're making, what are their patrons' other interests outside of this specific content theme, and where are other platforms going when it comes to dealing with this content risk. More often than not, when we deal with those risk assessments, it does not yield a new policy or any type of new enforcement. A lot of stuff dies on the cutting room floor, and I'm comfortable with that. I think that's a very good thing. Any instance where we can avoid inserting ourselves between a creator and the audience that is searching for their content and like are motivated enough to give someone money to continue to make sure that content exists in perpetuity, we want to facilitate that. But when it becomes, as it did with QAnon, so synonymous with calls for violent action or on and offline harassment, we really have to step in and make sure both our brand, but more importantly, our users are protected from the behavior that yields. And the content, the policy risk assessment document that we are, is always in beta. It's never set in place. Is where we start dealing with those risks and really getting into the weeds of how those risks are revealing themselves.
And Andy, you guys have been in the news lately, made a big decision to give a bunch of extremists the boot. Bravo to you. How can you be sure that they were all extremists, and what led to that? And how do you define an extremist?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's been a hot topic, I think ever since Charlottesville happened. So to answer, how do we define extremists? Really, when in the day in the life of anyone on a trust and safety or moderation team, you're asking yourself, like, what is the abuse vector here? What is the potential harm that is going to happen if action or non-action is landed on, right? And so for the people that we decide to remove from our platform, the call was made where, like, after looking at how these communities are interacting with each other, with themselves, and with other people who might not even be in these spaces in the first place, the determination was the harm that would propagate from this would result in further radicalization into extremist beliefs. And what that might look like is dehumanizing different communities, glorifying violence against different communities, normalizing beliefs that are dehumanizing. And it always starts off as something that I think most people would kind of label as like banal, like, oh, like it was a joke. But really, it starts off as like a pipeline, right? There's a process. No one turns into an extremist from day one. And it's a slow and deliberate process that I think is pretty insidious that most people aren't really aware of, right? It's kind of like the analogy of like the frog in the boiling pot of water. You turn it up like 1 degree at a time, and realistically, like, you don't really understand what's happening until you're like, oh my God, I'm at this rally at the state capitol. But yeah, it's a situation where I think we're always asking ourselves, like, what is the risk of allowing certain communities to stay? What harm will they cause to the brand, to our users here, maybe even to themselves or to society at large? I think any type of social media or communications platform at some point of scale operates almost like a pseudo government, in the sense that, like, and I'll use Facebook as an example because they're one of the largest. Facebook, if they do not flesh out their self-harm operational procedures, it is actually a public health crisis, because that's how many reports come in. That's how many people every second, every minute, every hour are impacted. And so we make these decisions based on, what is the impact that we're going to see if we choose to do nothing, or if we choose to do something that might be a little like weak-handed compared to a more heavy-handed response. And so the determination that Discord made was the value generated by allowing these specific communities and individuals to stay did not outweigh the harms that we saw for our platform, for our brand, for society at large, and for our users.
So, you know, I'm sure that part of this is coded language, right? Cameo was famously in hot water for, you know, an athlete and I think a hip hop personality conveying in a message anti-Semitic coded language on their platform. You know, and that was just one big example because, you know, it's Cameo and their celebrities all of a sudden being anti-Semitic or assumed to be when it really was probably innocuous to their own eyes and they couldn't even tell that. And that's in their own culture. How do you handle this in cultures where your content policy folks or the content moderators are not quite so familiar with what's going on there? You know, as an India specialist, yeah, I know just from, you know, watching the culture develop and trends and the way that slang gets used and things like that, it's really hard to tell the nuances of these things, both in spoken word and in writing. How do you handle stuff like that? Because you're both, you know, expanding in really interesting ways, and I'm sure that this is something that you think a lot about. So what do you say?
I would say we approach it with two baseline assumptions, and that's one, that we don't understand the context, and then two, we have to extend as much doubt benefit as possible, and then kind of be talked out of that. Like that's kind of like the first position, and then, you know, assume the goodness is there, give the creator or whoever is you know, disseminating the problematic rhetoric the benefit of the doubt, and then look at the surrounding details and see what erodes that benefit. And I think another answer to the question is really like diversification of internal understanding. We do not have yet at Patreon international policy specialists. We have a role open for one, and I'm very interested to meet with this individual will be, you know, so that they can help us tackle these. But I think that assumption, more often than not, that you don't understand the on the ground context is really going to help you avoid taking some wayward actions. At the same time, I think the same approach of getting as much diversified understanding of the examples on the ground, knowing that the context of you know, the context of Egypt isn't going to be the same as the context that I was raised in the United States, where underrepresented groups, that they look very different in a different country than they do here. And, you know, I think approaching these issues with that level of humility really does a service to you know, to the people that you're trying to create policies and features for. And that also goes to like the way we can service internal stakeholders. Like I'm 90% of the time I'm dealing with the content moderation team, but every once in a while I get a request from our international team that is like, hey, we are looking at this locale. Can we get a sense for what the independent creator sphere looks like in France or in you know, in Spain or wherever it is that we're trying to lean in. And then just spending time with, you know, with the individual creator legacy there really can help you elevate or like can like illuminate some content risks that you wouldn't have seen. I would say more often than not, Julian, the risks are 90% overlapping. Like the people here are dealing a lot of the time with the same concerns that the people in these other locales are. But there are cultural nuances, like little nuggets of cultural nuances that can come back and bite you. And as we know, some of the like seemingly smaller items can be the ones that blow up and you know, metastasize in a way that you wouldn't have anticipated when you first approached them.
What do you think about that, Andy? How do you guys handle this?
Yeah, I think the first and foremost thing that we kind of think about is like where our gaps are. So how do you know what you don't know? A lot of this is, you know, understanding whether or not you have these footholds in other locales, right? So for instance, monitoring growth in like other countries, if I know that like, hey, Latin America has seen like a surge of like user registrations, looking at like understanding what some of those cultural norms are on social media or even in like the larger societal context is going to be more increasingly important. And it isn't always going to be a case where we have in-house expertise or specialization. And so it's partnering with NGOs, with third parties, with academics and scholars who very intimately understand this space is going to be an increasing thing as for any company that I think starts to scale internationally and starts to really globalize. And like Sean mentioned, there's a lot of cultural nuances that you have to navigate, right? No one would in America would think that like a webtoon can lead to like acts of mass violence, but we saw that happen in France. And like the nuances that go into assessing the risk there might not be best made by someone who works for a company that is pretty American centric, right? So I think like the partnerships that we build out with these NGOs, with their third parties, and with like scholars is going to be increasingly important because there's just so much that you have to understand. Like I mentioned before, when you get to a certain size, you're effectively like a mini government for like an online space, right? Discord has a couple 100 million users, and that's more than some countries, and that's a lot of responsibility. And to be able to hold that responsibility well with like due diligence means to understand that like you're probably not going to have all the answers, and that's okay. But like what we owe to the public, what we owe to our users, and what we owe to society is to find out who that best person is, and to make sure that we have systems, protocols, operations in place to really seek out that knowledge and understand how to effectively use that knowledge to best serve our diverse populations.
Well, Andy, we can be helpful here. That happens to be our wheelhouse. We got a deep bench of those guys all over the world. So I want to come back to brands and creators and things like that. How do you partner with brands, creators? And by brands, I mean any organization that is using it the way that a creator would, or other, so they're participating from a commercial perspective, not from a fan or observer perspective. What is your approach to that, and how can brands or major creators partner with you or collaborate with you to be helpful and avoid risk on their own? Sean.
I unfortunately do not have a good answer for that. I don't really, and that's not really my wheelhouse. I would defer to Andy if he has anything anything to say on that, but I'd be interested to hear it.
Sure. Again, I'm no marketing expert either, so branding is not my forte, but I think it really varies platform by platform, right? You kind of have to understand how a product is designed, what its intent is, and how do people actually adopt the use of the product, because that's going to, I think, inform how these spaces look like and what the value proposition is for like the user base. So for Discord, we kind of navigate a fine line between like public and private spaces. It's default private by default because this is not like Twitter or Facebook where I think you can act as a megaphone and you're like, here's something that I care about and I want to like share this with my network. This is in fact more of a closed space environment where it's like, hey, on the private side, you have to get an invitation to enter a Discord server. You can't just like search for them, right? There might be some spaces that are a little more public than others. So for instance, if we have like partnerships with like certain gaming studios where, Roblox or Fortnite might have like a giant public server. And those spaces, I think like how you engage with our platform is really like what we are going to ask is, what do you want to get out of this partnership? What do you want to get out of your interactions with the users here? I think in terms of like the very public spaces, similar to Patreon, we really see like a unique niche of an audience of like participants of a passion economy, right? People opt into things that they care about. No one's going to opt into things that they're lukewarm about. So you have this supercharged, super energized user base who are like diehard fans to like your casual players. And so I think in terms of like a branding perspective, like, cool, what do you want to do with a user base that is probably going to be a lot more activated than if you were to like run TV ads? That's like the biggest question that I would kind of have on the top of mind when looking at like partnerships from a branding perspective.
Oh, so that was very useful. But I think the question that I'm aiming to look into is, let's say that brands, creators, etc., they are active in a community, and all of a sudden someone cancels them and they get assaulted with tons of malware or fraudulent schemes or phishing or porn or whatever, right? What do they do? How do they, you know, what exists to stop that? How can they sleep at night or be helpful to, or using coded language on their niche issue that wouldn't normally come up in like, you know, a list of key phrases of hostile or harmful language, but that would definitely be disconcerting to them.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two
I hope
ways.
that's
that
not a
think.
curveball. I know we didn't discuss that on the speaker prep call, but I don't know if that's something folks think about.
No, it's a good question. There's kind of two ways that I would approach this. So one is like, hey, if I'm a brand or I am a company and I want to partner with Discord or Patreon, and all of this abuse is going to my way, it's to make sure that these communication pipelines exist with like the platform itself, to like understand that like, hey, we look at servers as just community spaces, right? And so as a community space, we are under attack from like harassment or malicious campaigns, and we would address that, you know, according to our community guidelines. The second way that I would think about that is like, what happens when my brand gets associated with activity that my brand doesn't necessarily stand for? And I think that's where public statements and really like outward facing messaging is really going to matter and is super important, right? The last thing that you want, and this was like a pretty hot debate on a lot of online forums, is like Pepe the Frog as iconography of the alt-right and of extremists, right? So what happens when something starts off as not necessarily politically charged or associated with a group of bad actors, but is then adopted or kind of commandeered to be as such? And that is where like definitive stances, public definitive stances, are going to be increasingly more and more important, and making those decisions early on based on like what your brand's values are is imperative.
Yeah, and that Andy, I was going to raise the Pepe Frog item as well. I would actually recommend, there's a really good documentary about the San Francisco artist who created Pepe the Frog and then kind of lost control of his character. I forgot his name, but I think it's on Amazon and it's called Feels Good Man. I would big recommend people check that out. But to sort of to Andy's point, for us, like discerning what realms creators do and do not have control of is really important for acknowledging or discarding accusations of like account takeovers or sort of insurgents from people who are not there for the best of intentions. There are a couple of instances of creators who have Patreons and other presences losing control of like their subreddits, because the subreddit became such like a counter, whatever the theme is. It became more about countering that theme than it did about like talking about the latest episode or the latest essay or the latest piece of work. And acknowledging when that turn has happened, and not holding creators accountable for some of the rhetoric that they neither encouraged nor even liked. That's something that's really important for us when it comes to approaching accounts from a policy perspective. There are a few instances of that where like can't think of, I don't know that I would share
Yeah, I was
names,
just
but
about
like
to ask, like what
yeah.
are the kinds of things that you see creators and brands, like what kind of things come up that are just like that are too difficult for them to manage on their own, or that warrants like, an email to you guys with, come running with their hair on fire?
Yeah, like sometimes claims of harassment, either on the individual level or like this group of people are harassing me on every platform presence I have. And I think they are on Patreon. Could you please investigate them? That's something that happens. Harassment is a particularly tricky one because anyone who's had a tweet, a tweet deleted or had their Twitter account suspended knows it's very easy to just turn around and create another one. And when you get removed from a platform for harassment, I wouldn't say more often than not, but more frequently than I would like, that just encourages future harassment from that individual. It kind of adds fuel to the fire more than it dispels the behavior. But yeah, that's one of the claims. Content theft is another one that is, it's really tricky for us. People saying my Patreon exclusive content made its way onto Twitter, and I don't know how to get it down. We don't either. We're not Twitter. It's really difficult to get that stuff taken down sometimes, especially when the accounts are low leverage and low visibility. But I would say bullying and harassment, content theft, and then I would say chargebacks and fraudulent payment methods are some of the things that creators reach out to us the most about, and that we're like kind of the fixes for those claims are constantly in beta, because those people who are doing that stuff, they're evolving too. They're not standing in place and doing the same thing twice. They're adopting new methods, and they're adopting new approaches to creating havoc online, and we need to be as adaptable. And thus far we have been, but it's going to continue to get difficult.
Andy, what are the kinds of things that you see along those lines? I'd wager that they're kind of in a different variety. What are some of the surprises that brands are like, or individuals or whatever, are just like, whoa, I didn't even know that that's possible here. How can we fix this?
Yeah, I think harassment definitely is a big one. I mean, we're a chatting platform, right? So like anything that you might see on any other chatting platform is likely to be something that we deal with here. Harassment is a big one. It's probably one of our more populated report categories. I think our risks tend to be a little bit different than other products because we are private by nature and private by default. So our risks tend to be more aligned with, like, especially future risks, echo chambers, right? And it's a little bit different in the sense that, like, if you look at how echo chambers are talked about in like YouTube's algorithm, or like algorithms that recommend you content, we don't actually recommend content in that way. A lot of these are like opt-in, self-driven spaces. So like, how a lot of users would normally go and find Discord servers is like, I might be like a bird watcher. So I'm like in all these subreddits about bird watching. I might be in Facebook groups about bird watching, and eventually someone creates like a bird watching Discord. So we see a lot of like third-party platform migration, where it's like, the funniest way that I heard this described was, this is like real-time Reddit, where like you can have ongoing discussions with people. And so because we don't actually push content to people through algorithms, I think the risks in the like echo chamber areas of abuse tend to be like, well, what happens if I am a bad actor or someone who has ideologies or beliefs or interests that might not serve our platform's values? And how we think about that really is just like, cool, well, what do we want Discord to stand for? What types of communities are we talking about when we say we're trying to give people the tools to create community and belonging online?
So we're just winding, and we've got folks tuning in for the next one. Hi, Shuchi. So we're just winding down. Chill out. Hey, cool. She's a wonderful person, also in San Francisco.
I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna let you. Oh,
no, it's all right.
Yeah.
All good. What emerging risks are you seeing right now? I think maybe we should close with that. Things that you see on the horizon that bear the resemblance of something to think about, either for your own platform or for everybody in general. Like, what's out there that's percolating?
I would say disinformation is something that is not new, but it's something that's kind of taken center stage over the past 24, 36 months. And it's something that kind of migrates from realm to realm. Sometimes it's electoral, sometimes it's climate related, sometimes it's historical revisionism. And I think that's one that is it's just kind of like a snail that's moving across all different content themes. It's something that we're gonna. I don't know that we'll ever have a one size fits all response to it when it raises itself different contexts. But I would say that's one of the more emerging user-generated content related problems that we're seeing. It's like it's like, how do you disprove the non-disprovable? I cannot prove to you that Barack Obama doesn't subsist on a healthy diet of baby blood. I don't monitor him enough, to disprove that claim for you. But there are people who believe that, and they believe that because they were told as much by an independent content creator, or sometimes they were told by someone who's working for a legacy news organization. Those are trusted figures, and they wield a lot of power. And to the extent that we are facilitating growth amongst those figures, it's something that we're going to continue to have to deal with. At the same time, Andy, in his last response, was kind of, he didn't allude to it, he plainly said it. There is a level of buy-in with our platforms that we can't really compete with. Someone is willing to give $10 a month of their hard-earned money to someone because they want to advance their, that person's independent production. We have to acknowledge that buy-in is there already, and inserting ourselves between that is going to be tricky. That's not a reason to not take action when disinformation is percolating, but it is something to acknowledge, because the trade-off there is confirmation. If people think that there is a cabal of Satanist pedophiles, and they're learning this through a creator who is bankrolling a platform, their content through Patreon, and then that person's Patreon page gets removed. Does that function as confirmation for that, for that suspicion, or for that, that truth that those people have bought into? Sometimes it does, and that doesn't mean you don't take the action or write the policy, but it is something you have to think about. Like, are you advancing? Or are you perpetuating the harm that you were trying to mitigate in the first place?
I think
a great way to do that is,
oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say a great way to do that, and it's imperfect, but is to catch it as early as you can before it snowballs into a giant monster. And you are initiating a speech suppression news cycle that you want to know part of, and isn't really at the core of why you took the action in hand.
Right.
But it's something that you need to insert in your risk assessment, because it's a factor that's going to arise more often than not.
Well, it's got to be tricky for both of you guys, because there's economies around these things, right? Like, yes, they invest $10 a month in this creator, but the creator's been hustling on Instagram and Twitter, and feeding into their kooky confirmation bias, really chewing into YouTube communities, and then by the time they've promoted themselves on there for free, then they end up on you. And it's the health and wellness crowd, the conspirituality types. You've got the Jordan Peterson variety, who we mentioned this the other day. Who was we don't need to get into it deep right now, but what was the name of the person that Jordan Peterson booted himself in response to?
Yeah, Patreon removed a creator. His name was Sargon of Akkad. His name is Sargon of Akkad.
So
yeah, and then in response to that, a lot of principled self-removals occurred.
Sure. So they've got these huge economies around them, right? And in some cases, and this is probably pretty interesting to the folks who are tuning in right now, sometimes their products get wrapped up in that. Sometimes they're enjoying some revenue from what's being promoted there, or can, anyway, there's risk there. And I'd wager that that's really important for you guys to be thinking about as well, because that seems to be a big shift and trend. Andy, do you have a closing comment to that kind of issue?
Yeah, I think the big thing here to really think about is, how do we not get wrapped up in this? And I mentioned earlier, like, very public facing statements and stances, but like ultimately, and we see this with communication platforms, but I wager to say that this is pretty true of monetization platforms as well, where, I think a lot of our hesitancy from our communities tend to be like, hey, I'm trying to grow my community. So like, kicking people, removing people from the platform, making sure that they don't have space or occupancy here, how does that actually serve my company? How does that actually serve my community? Like, we often are seen as the antithesis of like growth and monetization. I'd argue it's actually the opposite, in the sense that from like an engagement standpoint, what we have found is like when you remove toxic actors, or when you remove people who tend to be disruptive with either their behavior or their ideologies, we have this general like rule that we witness on social media spaces, right? It's like the 1% are like your super users, and 9% are like your casual contributors, and then like 90% are like your lurkers. So when you remove the toxic people who are very vocal, who are very active, you actually create opportunity and space for people who might be lurking, or just your casual contributors, to occupy more of that space. And you have healthier growth, organic growth, and community and engagement that way. And I'd argue that you'd probably see the same with platforms, right? Much like how people might spark a bunch of self-removal because they're like, cool, you remove Sargon of Akkad. The opposite of that spectrum exists as well, where it's like, I don't want to be associated with a platform that is okay with like Sargon of Akkad. So what are the opportunity costs in not doing something? And what are like the vectors of growth that you're missing out on because of that? So I think there's opportunities for monetization, for growth, for engagement that are missed because people like, it's really hard to evaluate opportunity costs. It's not quantifiable. It's also not proven, right? But you leave the door open for these things to naturally occur.
Yeah, and I would just add, Andy, that like one way to kind of mitigate both of those concerns is to build like a robust appeals process or pathway back, so that if there's a miscommunication, if someone has changed and they have distanced themselves from past rhetoric or past thoughts, that you don't close the door forever for people to monetize, or in Discord's case, use your servers to communicate with their communities. We don't, in most instances, we don't close the door on anybody forever. We very much would like for a lot of the removals we've done to come back to the platform because we misunderstood what it was that initially got them removed, or because they have had a change of heart and don't believe that whatever it was anymore. And that's another process that's just constantly evolving as we scale. And I imagine it's something that platforms that are operating at a larger scale than Patreon is really struggle with. It's tricky.
Well, it sounds like you guys, like me, after Lord Palmerston of the UK, famous foreign minister, we have no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. Yes, so let's keep it healthy, cool, and safe. Gentlemen, thank you so much for doing this today. I know that folks are wondering about this. I'm pretty sure that there's going to be a lot of heated arguments with relatives around Thanksgiving where they just have to show people this video. I know that certainly there's going to be a lot of folks on Facebook where I'm just like, guys, just look at my session on this, please. So thank you so much for opening up the book and letting us into your heads a little bit. You guys are great, and I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Andy.